China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep, for when she awakes, she will move the world. This quote from French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte has proven to be absolutely prophetic, as international journalist Fareed Zakaria writes in his book The Post-American World. The country of China has been accelerating in economic terms for the past several decades. He notes that back in the day, America was almost unilaterally considered the world's top economic power. However, today when we look at who has the biggest skyscrapers, the most powerful countries in the Asian region, it's not America but China. This reflects the growing trend of China's economic growth outpacing the United States, perhaps positioning them to become the world's foremost economic power someday. This has many in the West understandably concerned. Back in the 1990s, when China first started embracing a few capitalistic tendencies, many people, like then President George H.W. Bush, thought that it would be a good thing and that democracy would come to China along with prosperity. However, the opposite has happened. As The Economist magazine reported in February of 2021, China has only grown more repressive as they have grown more rich, leading everyone across the West to be concerned with their growing economic prowess. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly thrown a wrench in all of this. As NPR reported back in March of 2020, when the pandemic first started to hit, it hit China the hardest, forcing them to close major ports and lock down their cities. Because of this, many people in the West thought that the pandemic would halt Chinese economic growth. Because of this, it's worth asking the question, has COVID-19 halted China's growing economic momentum? The answer is no. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has only accelerated China's economic momentum. This is because China's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic allowed it to grow while Western democracies faltered. Other countries have turned to China in terms of investment, and finally, the authoritarian tide that favors China has only accelerated. Let's start off with the fact that China's handling of the pandemic has allowed them to prosper while Western democracies have faltered. As the Wall Street Journal noted in February of 2021, at that time, Chinese officials in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Wuhan held pool parties across the country to celebrate the country's squashing of the COVID-19 pandemic. At that time, the pandemic infected very small amounts of Chinese citizens, as the government's brutal lockdowns proved to be substantially effective. Meanwhile, in the US, the Omaha World Herald, one of my favorite local news sources, notes that the United States has recently just hit the milestone of 566,000 deaths. The strong majority of these deaths being concentrated in the winter of 2020 to 2021. The truth is, China squashed the pandemic in their homeland early on, while America really struggled to contain the virus for so long. As a result, China's been allowed to reopen, and this has only prompted their economic growth. As the Wall Street Journal noted in January of 2021, in late 2020, China actually surpassed the United States in terms of how much foreign investment was coming into the country. This was because in 2020, China was one of very few countries to actually grow by 2% amid the pandemic, whereas America shrank by about 4% and countries like Germany shrank by about 5%. The truth is, China stamped down the pandemic very early in the cycle, and this allowed their momentum to continue on, while America, its chief competitor, faltered for almost a year. Additionally, the other countries have turned to China for more economic support in recent years. It's no secret that America botched its pandemic response, getting about half a million of their citizens tragically killed. This has made America look like an unreliable ally for much of the world, making them more likely to turn to China. As the China Daily reported on December 24th of 2020, the European Union at that time signed a joint comprehensive plan of investment that cut red tape and made it easier for their citizens to invest in the People's Republic of China. This was largely a rebuke of the United States, as the US was a really unreliable trade partner amid the pandemic. As the China Daily explains, this represents the European Union and many countries within it rejecting America in favor of China. Another place that this has happened is Myanmar. As The Economist magazine reported in February of 2021, Myanmar's recent coup was, from an international perspective, an embrace of China. The new government, as soon as it took power, almost immediately signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is an initiative China launched in order to project its soft power onto third world countries in order to gain influence. All of this evidence quite clearly displays that the COVID-19 pandemic has made China look like a solid rock of foundation, while America has looked like a shaky institution that could collapse at any time due to a pandemic. This has made the world much more eager to invest in China rather than the US, prompting even more economic momentum. However, finally, perhaps the most convincing reason why the pandemic has only accelerated China's economic growth is because it has accelerated the authoritarian tide. As the Foreign Affairs magazine reported in March of 2021, the world in recent years has undergone an unprecedented lurch to the authoritarian side. Countries like Russia and China have been gaining more and more power, which has also given them more and more economic power. As the Yale Southeast Asian Studies Commission reports, the pandemic has without doubt prompted many leaders to embrace authoritarianism over free market liberalism, as the pandemic has without doubt supported countries that have suppressed individual rights in exchange for public health. As former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger notes in his book Diplomacy, countries tend to gain the most power when they embrace what works over what's right. And as China suppressed their citizens' rights in favor of public health, many countries around the world have followed suit in what Kissinger calls realpolitik. Because of this, China's economic growth is only bound to accelerate. As the world becomes more and more authoritarian because of the pandemic, China will only have better and better relationships with these countries. This will undeniably translate to soft power and money for the People's Republic of China. To conclude, today we talked about China's economic growth. More specifically, whether the COVID-19 has thrown a permanent wrench in their record-breaking economic momentum. The answer is it has not. It has only accelerated China's growth. This is because China's handling of the pandemic allowed them to grow while other economies faltered. Additionally, nations across the world have turned to China, and finally, the authoritarian tide has only been accelerated by the pandemic. When Napoleon Bonaparte said that China was a sleeping giant back in the 1700s, many people thought he was crazy because of it. However, his words have turned out to be prophetic.
Is that a 19?